All right, well, welcome everyone. Thanks again for those of you who are new here this afternoon and those of you who are joining us again after our morning sessions. Thank you for attending our Wildlife Film and Photography Symposium today at CSU. My name is Jamie Jacobson, and I have the honor of moderating our panel this afternoon. I'm really excited about this. I guess I should say a word first that myself and a number of other faculty that have been in this space today and on our panel are working to build and expand a Center for Science Communication here at Colorado State University. And as part of the center, one of our main goals is to foster better communication outcomes in pursuit of socially sustainable environmental, agricultural, and health systems. So I'm really just thrilled to be part, in some small way, of the wonderful scholars that are seated before me today, because their work, both their research and creative scholarship, really hinges upon exploring unique communication approaches to human-wildlife interactions. It's a fascinating topic, and I think some of the video and photography presentations that we saw already really set us up nicely for that. And one of the things that I'm personally really curious about is just to explore how using different types of communication approaches, whether it's documentary film, or it's photo video slideshows, or it's social marketing approaches, or social media, how this might help people better engage in wildlife, how we go about translating research in the field into practice that the public can then understand. And I'm also just interested in hearing about some of your personal experiences working on these fascinating projects. So I'd like to say a couple words about our panel as an introduction, and just a few notes about the format. We have 4 panelists and 3 presentations. So I think we'll go through the presentations one by one, and then at the end of the session, leave a lot of room for Q&A with the audience, because I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions based on their work. And I know I have some of my students in the audience, so I want to give you a chance to engage with our wonderful panelists here. So a few brief words of introduction for the folks we have before us today. I'm going to maybe skip out of order. I think Professor Katia Abrams, who's an associate professor in our Journalism and Media Communication Department, who's 2 in. We've got her presentation up first. Katie's expertise is at the intersection of strategic communication and natural resource issues. Her work contributes to socially sustainable agricultural, food, and natural resource systems. She's currently leading 2 long-term wildlife-human interaction studies that are funded by the National Park Service. Thank you, Katie. Next on our panel, we have Assistant Professor Kyle Horton, who studies bird and bat migration in Colorado State University's Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology. He was a Rose postdoctoral fellow at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology from 2017 to 2019. His research, and that of his lab, focuses on the study of bird, bat, and insect migration using a range of tools and approaches, and including the use of radar, acoustics, and citizen science data. His work addresses a handful of fundamental questions of migration and its biology, including population estimates, impacts of artificial light, and migration forecasting. Then, next on our panel, we have a joint presentation by Associate Professor Joe Brown and Katia Nikitina. Apologize. First, Associate Professor Joe Brown is a filmmaker and educator based at the University of Denver. His documentary work has screened at the Big Sky Documentary Film Festival, the International Wildlife Film Festival, the Wild and Scenic Film Festival, and many more venues. Joe is particularly interested in environmental documentary and wildlife photography. He's very active in the University Film and Video Association, UFVA, and has recently served as the association's vice president. Katia is a social ecological systems researcher and conservation proponent. She studies relationships between ecosystem health, animal welfare, and human social structures. Katia strives to develop successful policy and program interventions through rigorous analysis, community engagement, and the promotion of traditional ecological knowledge. Her career interests focus on the human dimensions of biodiversity conservation. She's dedicated to creating a regenerative future with and for today's youth, in a world that is sensitive to the needs of human beings, animals, and the biosphere. So I'm hoping we can have a round of applause for our panel. And we'll have Dr. Katia Abrams up as our first presenter. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. All right, thank you for attending, everybody, and I'm honored to be here with these other panelists as well, and with Jamie, our director of our Center for Science Communication. I'm going to present to you today on a series of projects that I've been working on that use creative communication and behavior change practices to try to help protect wildlife, in which communication science as well as behavior change science were at the center of what we were trying to advance. So I'm sure that the symposium and just your experience with media in general today has shown you that there are a lot of media that are visually portraying wildlife in quite spectacular ways. And some of the latest camera technologies and communication norms now mean that our media ecosystem is flooded with amazing photos and videos that show us the natural world. And some people might say that more people and more than ever are drawn to immerse themselves in nature and in wild places. And while that can absolutely, of course, be a good thing and an important thing, we also see how it can result in harm to wildlife and to people alike. Sometimes maybe we look at photos like this or we think of recent experiences that we can recall from news reports or social media, and we might chuckle, we might poke fun, maybe we get angry and we shame these people. But we at least think to ourselves for a second that, that would never be me. I would never do that, ever. My dad was really proud to share this photo with me on a hike in Rocky Mountain National Park when I was kind of like going through the gravel as he was accidentally like dropping bits of popcorn crumbs, and I was like, we can't feed the wildlife. And he was like, when we went on our road trip out to Rocky Mountain National Park, you fed the chipmunks in the park, and I have photo evidence to prove it. And he got home and he sent me this photo. So you can tell I was a 90s child we had turquoise and white shoelaces, one on each foot. Anyways, so we think like, surely I would never, but I bet you can all maybe recall an experience that you had, and maybe in which you got really close to wildlife, maybe you even petted a fluffy cow, maybe you accidentally harassed wildlife, maybe you left food out, maybe you dropped something on the trail. So we can all relate to these things that, sometimes go horribly wrong, as in the case of these examples here, and ultimately have additive impacts on wildlife. So wildlife tourism, media, and marketing can entice people with suggestive imagery and the promises of experiences that might actually be harmful to wildlife and their ecosystems. And then when people get out there, we hope that maybe they'll be compelled to protect wildlife through seeking out education opportunities, or through, of course, law enforcement, through laws that are then enforced by officers or rangers. But those two approaches are not the only way that we can encourage people to act in ways that minimize harm to nature. Those in communication science and behavior change science know that there are fractions of people for which education is enough. So your cheerleaders, those who are already going to be on your side, or your choir, where they just need education to change their behavior. Tell me how, tell me what to do, and I will do it. And then for some, they need the law to change their behavior. And then for a sizable portion of our population, they just need help. So most people will not disagree with the statement of like, I would like to protect wildlife, or I think wildlife are important, or I value wildlife. But there can be barriers in the way in getting them to act in ways that protect those wildlife. And when that's the case, when they're interested in the behavior, but there's barriers, a framework called social marketing is the best return on investment. And social marketing is just an audience-centered framework that uses some of the techniques that are used to sell car, cereal, and vacation to try to change people's behavior in a way that benefits the individual as well as society. Some of the components of social marketing include selecting a very specific behavior instead of trying to get people to adopt behaviors under a broad theme like keep wildlife wild. Using a mix of behavior change theories and concepts, as well as audience research, so you can understand what the audience's barriers and motivators might be around that behavior. And all of this is done so that you can design an approach that positions the behavior as a superior exchange that is socially desirable and easily done, using the marketing mix tools that I referred to earlier that marketers use to sell you laundry detergent. By the design of a framework, social marketers view their audiences as decision makers with choices, rather than students to be educated or incorrigibles to be regulated. And this comes from Nancy Lee, who is one of the pioneers and most cited individuals for social marketing. Now, how does this involve the National Park Service and wildlife management agencies? Well, these agencies do a lot of things that can support wildlife protection and people's behavior that affects wildlife, but they do so a little bit indirectly rather than explicitly targeting behavior change as the goal. And social marketing can help fill in some of those gaps that these different elements that are already baked into most wildlife management agencies to encourage pro-environmental behaviors. So starting in 2014, thanks to Joe Champ, who's back there in the audience, at the time, we were a science communication committee. Now we're a departmental center. We were approached by the National Park Service and eventually NOAA Fisheries to work together to try to develop natural resource managers' capacity to apply social marketing to help protect wildlife. But we also had the goal of creating examples within the context as well as the constraints in which these agencies operate. So these projects have addressed a few different issues. The first one that we worked on was trying to encourage people to keep their distance from wildlife. And the reason that this is important from an ecological perspective is because we want to reduce what's called wildlife habituation. We don't want wildlife to get too comfortable around people. We also don't want people to get too comfortable around wildlife, which happens when wildlife gets habituated. It's a nice little circle. And we also don't want people to be feeding wildlife. And so by encouraging people to first keep their distance from wildlife can prevent some of those harmful impacts on them. And of course, you saw those examples earlier in some of those images. We also prevent harm and injury to people that some of the wildlife, especially the larger wildlife in national parks, pose a threat of. But also, keeping your distance from wildlife might have some cultural impacts as well. So in Hawaii, for example, and working with NOAA, getting too close to wildlife, harassing them, playing with them is viewed as culturally disrespectful because wildlife, like spinner dolphins and sea turtles, are viewed as amakua, or ancestral spirits or guardians. And then our most recent project sought to reduce instances of accidental or unintentional wildlife feeding. Not like that fool we saw earlier on the slide with the peanut in hand brought to the park specifically for the chipmunks. This is my dad on the trail, right? This is somebody who's dropping popcorn. This is somebody who is camping and leaves a few items out that they forgot or just didn't want to take the time to put away. And so we sought to develop a social marketing approach that would encourage more people to better manage their food and other wildlife attractants. So over the next few slides, I'm just going to show you some snippets and point to some of the behavior change foundations that we integrated within these social marketing approaches. And I can, during the panel time, can revisit any of these things in more detail during the Q&A portion. So in developing these projects, we started by looking at, well, okay, you say these are problem behaviors, how are you currently communicating about it? What infrastructure, what policies, what education do you have in place to try to encourage people to keep their distance from wildlife? And a lot of the communication approaches just boil down to a simple and repeated message. Do not approach or harass wildlife. That's it, which is a little bit vague. And so one of the things that we sought to do was to help people visualize and emphasize the distance that you need to keep away from most wildlife in national parks. So to improve upon the messages that they were currently communicating, you can see we use this hook of sometimes the best relationship is a long distance relationship where long distance tries to emphasize that distance. And then we use some infographics to help people visualize what that distance would look like in that space. And then we, of course, acknowledge that people do desire relationships with wildlife. And so by having that play on the long-distance relationship, we could help people connect this desired behavior of keeping a distance as still maybe achieving their goals of having a satisfactory relationship, but a long-distance relationship with wildlife. We also know that as people are approaching wildlife, they often have their camera in hand. We have data from Yellowstone National Park showing that to be true within the last decade. So to reach people, one of the reasons that people will seek out information in national parks is to find out, where do I see wildlife? And so we embedded our messaging within that kinds of communication that people would already be seeking out at visitor centers and on their websites, and encourage them to go to places where there, first of all, would be enough space that they would be able to have to get away from wildlife. There might even be volunteers or staff in those locations, and support them in still getting a good photo from the distances that they have to maintain from these wildlife. Continuing on to address the same behavior, but now with sea turtles. Sea turtles, probably as you imagine a sea turtle, you might imagine like, is it Crush from Finding Dory and Finding Nemo, that turtle? You know, you don't think of like a bison goring you, right? There's that you don't have that same threat with sea turtles as you do with some of the species in national parks. So to address this behavior, encourage people to keep a respectful distance of 10 feet from basking sea turtles in Hawaii, we did some similar things. We tried to align the desired behavior of keeping 10 feet with their desired experience. You go on vacation to Hawaii, you hope to have an amazing time, you hope to have a unique experience. And even just witnessing that behavior, Hawaii is one of the only places in the world in which sea turtles deliberately crawl out of the ocean to just bask on the beach, not just lay their eggs or nest. So they're getting to witness a really unique behavior, all of which you can see plenty clearly from 10 feet away. We help them visualize it, and then we make it socially desirable as well, in part through offering a replacement behavior of these forced perspective photos, where you have to be at least 10 feet away to achieve these photos, so you're getting a slightly better photo in the end. And we know that one of the key drivers of this like 10-minute long bucket list experience for people is to get a good photo, so we offer that up. When we expanded our Amazing from Afar campaign to try to address all of the federally protected marine species, which includes Hawaiian monk seals, Hawaiian spinner dolphins, and humpback whales, we had to get a little bit more creative. We also were going in at a time in which Hawaii had just released a new law banning swimming with spinner dolphins, requiring people to keep 50 yards at all times from the dolphins. So we had to do some things a little bit differently, even though you do see some similarities in the examples shown here compared to the previous one for sea turtles. The forced perspective photography, that replacement behavior doesn't really work very well, as we discovered, as our professional photographers tried a lot to try to get really good photos using that forced perspective. And so we developed this little die-cut Polaroid card that people could use, which works a little bit better, maybe signifies the desired behavior, as well as encourages them to keep their distance, because to fit inside that card, they would have to be a certain distance away. The other thing that we had to do was we integrated a commitment. Usually when you commit or say you're going to do something, you're more likely to follow through. So pledges, you've probably seen 50 pledges in your time today. Like you really haven't. But pledges are kind of a dime a dozen now. So we want to incentivize people to sign the pledge and make that commitment. And one of the ways in which we did that was when people signed the pledge, because they were committing to being kind to ocean kind and keeping their distances from these federally protected species, they would get special access to a list of additional places that they could see these wildlife because they were committing to being respectful. We also partnered with hotels, ocean gear rental companies, sightseeing tour operators to reach audiences, drive those pledge signatures, for which they would get a souvenir quality sticker so they could remember their identity as someone who is kind to ocean kind and follow through on their commitment. And then for our third campaign, we use a social marketing framework to encourage those picnickers and campers to store and manage their food. And what we know from previous research is people go camping for restorative purposes, to clear their mind. So connecting that desired behavior of having a clean campsite to clearing their mind, having a clear conscience. There's a subtle guilt appeal working there as well. We also wanted to ensure that the behavior was easily done, so we simplified and visualized the behaviors that we were asking them to do, and we also supported it through feedback, both positive and negative, so people would get a little reward, and it would encourage that habit when they got positive feedback on their report cards, which you can see. That's one of my grad students' hands filling out that report card there at Grand Teton National Park, and also get some gentle correction or more extreme correction if we wanted to involve law enforcement if it was a really egregious issue. We had the privilege of going to lots of different places to test these social marketing approaches, which you can see kind of represented visually in this slide. And just really briefly, we did find through conducting observations of people's actual behavior that when our social marketing interventions were in place, more people were staying the respectful or the safe distances from wildlife. More people were storing their food properly or staying closer to their food in the case of picnics. And it ranged from about 5 to a 30% difference compared to our control or pre-test conditions. And just a couple more slides here. We've had some success with these approaches, one of which is impacting others, which we always seek to do. We've seen other parks, cities, golf courses, of all places, adopting our materials and approaches to try to encourage people to keep respectful distances from wildlife. The Clean Campsite campaign's a little bit newer. We're about to launch the website for those materials to make it available to others. And then the other key contributing thing is because we were able to observe actual human behavior, we got to see the media impacts on people's behavior, which is something you don't always get to do, and something really important to understanding how we might design future social marketing approaches to encouraging actual behavior change rather than self-reported, because we all will say we want to protect wildlife, but we might not always follow through. Some of the challenges, and maybe these plant some seeds of ideas for questions for myself and the panelists later, is trying to build capacity around the social marketing framework. When we do this work in communication, they're like, cool graphic. Don't have to design that now. They pull the graphic, they put it on a sign, and they're like, we did it. We did social marketing, and that's not the case. So we have to try to help people understand that it is more than just a catchphrase or a graphic, that it's an entire framework for approaching how we shape and change people's behavior. The other challenge is social and visual communication and media trends that suggest or promise certain relationships or expectations with wildlife. And then we also have pressures and issues around global tourism and recreation, in which they might be after purely economic pursuits. Those are a few questions to plant for you for later. That's all that I have to share with you, so thank you. And I'll turn it over to, I think, Kyle, right? Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. So I'm super excited to get this invitation here to come chat with you all about bird migration. And I thought, what do I want to share with the audience? And I sort of landed on two things. I wanted, hopefully when you leave this room, you're quite fascinated by the phenomena of bird migration. And you know a little bit more about some of the threats that migratory birds are facing. And what I'll do is sort of leverage some of the research my lab does of how we try to quantify bird migration, but then how I use things like video, photography, to actually excite audiences about migratory birds and the diversity of migratory birds that might be passing through North America. So this bird here is a black-poll warbler. I remember taking this photo. I did my own migration, and I regularly do this. At this point, I was a graduate student at the University of Oklahoma, so I drove from Oklahoma down to South Texas to go see migratory birds arriving into North America. And I remember taking this photo on South Padre Island and just thinking about what this bird must have just done to get to where I was seeing it. This is a bird, if we captured it, let's say, on its wintering grounds or its breeding grounds, it would probably weigh about 12 grams. If we caught this bird right before it departed for its migration, in this case, I'm seeing this bird in South Padre Island in South Texas. At the point I had just seen it, it had just crossed the Gulf of Mexico, flying over the Gulf, probably leaving from the Yucatan Peninsula and flying for 20 to 30 straight hours to arrive in South Texas. Maybe shorter, maybe longer. So if we caught this bird just before it departed, let's say the Yucatan Peninsula, it would weigh approximately 24 grams. That's not a ton of weight, but if I asked you to double your weight in 5 days, you probably would not exist. So it's just remarkable about what these birds can do and the physiological feats that they go through to migrate. And one of the things that I think is just remarkable about bird migration is that the actual act of migration is largely unseen, given the title of my talk here. So this bird, I am seeing it, is no longer actively migrating. It's foraging and trying to rebuild its fat stores. But the actual action of migration is happening under the cover of darkness. While we all typically sleep, these birds are flying at high elevations, flying long distances, potentially crossing the Gulf of Mexico. So what my lab does here at CSU is try to quantify these movements. And I'll show you one example of how we do this and one tool we use to actually quantify these movements. So on this loop here that is playing, this is radar imagery from the night of April 27th, 2022, so this past spring. So these are radars that you might turn on to the Weather Channel, and you might see a thunderstorm passing through, or a hurricane arriving into Florida, or a tornado touching down in the Great Plains. But what sits behind the scenes of those data are a tremendous amount of biology that meteorologists work really hard to not show you, and I work really hard to show you. So what we do is use these data to try to quantify bird migration. And I just wanted to pull an example from maybe where a black-poll warbler was arriving into South Texas. So there is a radar in Brownsville, Texas, that's where these data are coming from. We can see migratory birds arriving over the Gulf of Mexico, over the water, in these speckles of blues and greens. The sun will set, and you will get this dramatic takeoff of migratory birds. As the sun sets, the birds enter into the atmosphere and will take flight, heading north for their spring migration journey. And when we see this takeoff, which will happen about now-ish, you're going to see birds lifting off, these greens here. These aren't a few birds taking off. These aren't tens of birds or hundreds of birds. These are millions of birds that are being detected on these radars at massive scales. So again, we can use tools like this to quantify bird migration, the number of birds, where and when birds are flying across the United States, other parts of the world. But what these data don't tell us is what species are actively migrating. And that's the fun of going out and seeing them the next day or the day before they take off. So this is where I saw that black-poll warbler was down in South Texas. And the scene looks something like this, where I might sit on the coast and wait for those birds to arrive. And they will arrive usually later in the day. They take off at sunset. They're going to fly for 20 hours. They might start making landfall at 2 p.m. the next day, 4 p.m. the next day, even later if they face adverse weather conditions. And there's no better spot to see these colorful songbirds that maybe come to your backyard, depending on where you're at across the U.S. So seeing a rose-breasted grosbeak here, hunkered down, starting to forage, rebuild those fat stores, or the colorful indigo bunting that blankets the central plains of the U.S., or a summer tanager here grabbing a quick snack from a friendly birder that has left out some oranges to rebuild those fat stores, particularly, yes, I'm feeding wildlife, for rebuilding those fat stores here in areas that are pretty inhospitable typically to these migratory birds. Or a black and white warbler gleaning up a tree, picking off insects off the bark. Or a hooded warbler here, which has this charismatic pose that is all too typical of this species, that if you found it on its breeding grounds, you'd be lucky to see it, you'd likely hear it, but in migration, they stand out like this as they forage on the ground in open spaces. Or the Cape May warbler, or least bittern crawling through the marshes of these coastal areas, a ruddy turnstone running down beaches, or a summer tanager, which is typically a forest-dwelling species that might sit 10 to 30 meters up in trees. In migration, you'll see it on the grass, doing its best to rebuild fat stores, not really caring about too much other than building those fat stores. And what I wanted to close on here is just thinking about the vast majority of these birds that I've just shown you. What they all have in common is they are migratory, and all of those species that I just showed you migrate under the cover of darkness. And we think about darkness maybe in, romantic settings like this, like Rocky Mountain National Park here in Colorado. Pristine skies that are fairly unadulterated by light pollution. So this is what we think about birds are migrating in. Pawnee National Grassland here. This is a photo I took this past spring. So beautiful view of the Milky Way, but if you look at the bottom of the screen here, we start to see light pollution in a very remote part of Colorado already creeping through. And this is a photo I took when I was at South Padre Island a few years ago, thinking about light pollution on these islands that are so important to these migratory birds. And I think about light pollution like it sounds, like it's a pollutant. And I was preparing these slides, and I remember taking this photo, but I had not noticed what the text said on this sign here. And it says, "Put the trash in the can, man." So it's obvious that they care about pollution, but pollution is thought of in many different ways. If I threw trash on the ground, you'd say you're polluting. But if I leave my porch light on at night, I'm still polluting, but it's often not thought of in that capacity. And why is light pollution important for migratory birds? This is an extreme example, but a case study that we work on. This is a video I took a few years ago at the September 11th Tribune Light Memorial in Lower Manhattan in New York City. These are really intense light sources. They're set up for a memorial. They mean a lot to many different people for different reasons, but they also are a classic example of how light pollution is impacting migratory birds in an extreme way. So this is me sitting below one of those towers of light. I'm looking skyward. And what you can see moving around in this video here is not insects, but those colorful songbirds that I just had shown in the previous slides. These are almost exclusively wood warblers, yellow warblers, northern parula, American redstart, tens of thousands sometimes of birds caught up in these lights. There's a good conservation message here. We turn those lights off when we visually see 1,000 birds circling those lights. We turn them off. It allows those birds to clear out on their fall migration journey. But we also work with stakeholders in areas like New York City. This was the past, let's see if this will play. We went there just last month to work with stakeholders there to go out and see their surveys. So every morning, volunteers go out and they try to find where birds might be interacting with light pollution and subsequently fatally colliding with buildings, the infrastructure of a city, with light pollution being a central driver to some of those patterns. So I'll just close on this short video we've put together talking about a project that we have here at CSU with those stakeholders, talking about light pollution in areas like national parks, and how we can work together in diverse ways to try to mitigate that threat to migratory birds. But it's a challenge, right? I can tell people to turn off their lights, but that message often doesn't resonate in a powerful way. There are polarized feelings around things like pollutants. We don't view light pollution polarized in the same way that climate change is. So it looks like there's probably room for messaging, positive messaging, to make early changes and how we can help migratory birds. So I'll show this video, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues up here.
Every fall and spring, billions of birds migrate through the airspace in the Western Hemisphere. A majority of these birds make this journey under the cover of darkness. Now, these birds face a variety of threats from climate change to land use change, but because they're migrating at night, one of the largest concerns that we want to address is the impact of light pollution on these birds.
One thing we've noticed is that folks don't really understand how far light can travel. So some of the impacts in our national parks are in wilderness areas or in pristine, otherwise natural areas, but we see light pollution coming from hundreds of miles away. Oftentimes where that light is coming from, people don't even realize that could be impacting a natural area, could be impacting wildlife or ecosystems, or even affecting the views for the public.
Convergence research is a different way of attacking a difficult social problem, social environmental problem in our case, where there's no single discipline that sort of owns the problem or can figure out how to solve it. And so you need to have deep interdisciplinary integration among people with very different disciplinary expertise, and those people have to come together sort of at the beginning of the problem, at the beginning of the project, to try to figure out a pathway to solving that problem. And it involves not just academics, but stakeholders from those communities as well, to work on that problem both on the social side and in our case on the environmental side, to try to understand how we can, in our case, reduce collisions with birds with lit buildings.
One thing that's really great about this collaborative convergence research is to bring different subject matter experts together to talk about common problems, common solutions, and find that common ground. And one thing we're really excited about too is to not only talk with researchers who are concerned about artificial light at night, but also talk with lighting industry and lighting designers and a lot of other stakeholders who are involved with light at night and lighting, to bring them into the fold as well.
At Georgia Audubon, we're trying to build places where birds and people thrive. And so with that motto, I'm doing everything from habitat restoration to community science and engagement, anything I can to make our cities more bird friendly. And a big component of that is light reduction and bird building collisions. I think what's most energizing and gives me hope about dealing with light reduction and bird building collisions is that there are tangible steps and information we can give to people to actually make their homes safer and their cities safer. There's lots of overlap with these things, with green cities and sustainability plans for buildings and even safety. There's so much that overlaps with this that there have to be ways for this to catch on and for us to educate and get people excited and understanding the importance of it. It's not something that's too foreign to them, and it just feels like there's a lot of momentum around the built environment and green cities and how it can coexist with wildlife.
Well, I think it's very important for us as we try to do this new type of convergence research, right? So it really depends on the stakeholders being engaged and seeing value in the research projects that we have going on. So listening to them and learning from them about what they need and what value they can take away from the work that we do is something that I'm looking forward to learning.
The natural night sky is a resource that is always there, and that is something that is not true of other environmental resources, whether it be air quality or water quality, things like that. The natural night sky is outside of the realm of Earth, and it is constantly shining. It is a constantly bright, luminous source. And so what we like to say is the nighttime resource is 100% recoverable. It is always there. We have that baseline to work towards, and that is a luxury and a really great benefit of working in this field. And so we like to communicate with folks when we're talking about light pollution that this is a problem that we can solve. And if we can use the latest technology and best practices, those stars and that Milky Way and some of those resources will come back to us. They'll shine through and we'll be able to recover that resource. That is a great benefit of working in this field, is that we have natural resource to come back to, and that's always there.
Thank you.
All right, hello everybody. Just as a reminder, I'm Joe Brown. I'm from the University of Denver. At least I'm not with the Buffaloes. And this is...
I'm Katia.
And Katia is a researcher at the University of Denver. We're going to talk a little bit more about what we do. This presentation is a little bit different in that we are going to be talking about a collaboration between two units at the University of Denver, Media, Film, and Journalism Studies, where I teach, and then the Institute for Human-Animal Interaction in the Social Work School at the University of Denver. We're also going to be talking about how you can involve students in wildlife documentary production. So it's kind of a case study. Oop, jumped a little bit too far. So a little bit more about who we are. Katia's going to give a background on what we call IHAC.
So the Institute for Human-Animal Connection.
Come to the mic, maybe.
Oh, sorry, that's better, huh? Great. The Institute for Human-Animal Connection elevates the relationships between people, other animals, and the environment to improve health and welfare for all. The University of Denver's Graduate School of Social Work program is unique in that it's the only program in the United States that has an ecological justice concentration that allows students to develop skills for addressing the environmental crisis.
Thanks, Katia. I'll come back to the mic. So as I said, this is a case study of a kind of cross-discipline collaboration. I arrived at the University of Denver about 3 years ago, and I mostly do environmental media. And I was pleased to find this eco-justice concentration in the social work school. So a lot of universities have internal grants, right, for professors from small amounts of money to large amounts. So I went for some low-hanging fruit and applied for like a $3,000 grant. And what I wanted to do was bring students out to Kearney, Nebraska to film the sandhill crane migration. It wasn't about research. It wasn't even about environmental issues at first. It was really just kind of about celebrating nature and maybe getting students talking. My film students are wonderful. Not all of them are as environmentally conscious as, like, say, myself as an environmental filmmaker. Some of them are more into fiction. Some are into social issues and into environmental issues, but I guess my idea was if I can get these film students out there and excite them with the cameras, maybe I can also teach them a little bit about the environment and then also involve the social work students. I wrote this grant the first year, and it was a small grant, but I was denied. And I was like, what? And they said, because I wrote it only under my name, and as we know at universities, for those of you who teach and research here, they're like, you need to cross-collaborate, and that's where, although I had been talking with the social workers previously, I hadn't fully involved them in the grant, brought us together, and we were able to get this grant, along with some others actually since that time, and we're continuing our work. But you can see, basically our hope here was to match film students with little knowledge of ecology, with social work students with little knowledge of film. We wanted to design what I like to call an easy wildlife photo or video experience during a large bird migration. I work more in the moving image than the still image. Birds move very quickly. It's very hard at times to photograph them. But, if you're familiar with the bird migration in Kearney, where the sandhill cranes go through every March, it's one of the largest crane migrations in the world. Somewhere between 600,000 and 800,000, perhaps more, are going through over a 6 to 8 week period. So you'll see 10,000 birds on the river, the Platte River, at any given time. And you're not going to miss that shot, right? There's a lot of birds. You're going to get one of them. So we were able to get the small grant and travel with about 8 or 10 of us out to Kearney, and that was last March. We have some sample media that we want to show you. It's just kind of a short trailer. As Greg had mentioned, I think before the break, we are developing a longer piece, but right now we just have this sample to show you. So we'll go full screen, and you can check this out. I also want to say that this was shot 90% by students, and the editing wasn't all students, but this was shot completely by students who really hadn't done wildlife photography or videography before.
Sandhill cranes are especially unique, and they're one of the oldest living bird species on the planet, maybe several million years old, unchanged. So the sandhill cranes have been spending the winter in the warm climes of Texas, Oklahoma, even as far south as Mexico. Now they're moving north into Siberia, so these birds are going way north. They need to stop here for 3 to 4 weeks and put on body fat. They're also very human-like. I mean, we attribute a lot of human attributes to these birds. They dance, not just for courtship, but they dance for joy, they dance for stress relief, and they dance all year long. So humans dance, these birds dance. They're known to mate for life, and they're very, very good parents. They keep their young with them for an entire year and teach them everything they need to know to get on in life. That we can attribute and we can see ourselves in a lot of their actions.
All right, so as I said, that's just kind of like a little sample media or a sample piece that demonstrates what students can do when given the opportunity. Let me get back to our PowerPoint slides and we'll continue.
Great, so talking a little bit about the logistics. This was a 4-day and 3-night trip that we went on in spring 2022 over spring break. As Joe had mentioned, this was through a small grant at the University of Denver, and we partnered with the Roe Audubon Society with Bill that you all just saw. And we got to rent out viewing blinds from Roe to see the birds, mostly at dusk and dawn, and then in the cornfields during the day. And we got to bring 4 film students with us and 2 social work students, along with 3 staff. All right, I think the next 2 are you.
So in terms of the student takeaways, I want to emphasize that this wasn't a class. This was really more of kind of a club-based experience. We have a film club and also kind of like a nature photography club at the University of Denver, so that's where we sourced some of the students. And I think that really kind of lessened the pressure on the students. It wasn't even really billed as like an alternative spring break sort of thing. It was just kind of a club activity. Hey, we're going to do this, and we have enough money basically to pay for your hotel rooms and pay for the gas in the car and buy you some food. Do you want to come? And they got really excited and of course signed up for it. We did it from like the Thursday before spring break, I guess, Thursday night to the Sunday night or Monday, the beginning of spring break. So they didn't have to sacrifice their whole spring break. But the things that they took away from the trip, other than like learning cameras and things, was that the Platte River is changing. So, we're in Fort Collins. Platte River's running somewhat close by, right? We have different forks of it coming from Wyoming and Colorado into Nebraska. And sitting with Bill and others that we've interviewed, we've learned a lot about the water issues that are present there, and that these water issues are also impacting the birds and the bird migrations. The main reason, or one of the reasons that the cranes like to land in this particular area, and Kyle, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not an ornithologist, but it's because of the nice quality of the Platte River being very shallow. There's a lot of food source around the river amongst the cornfields, but they like the shallow river water and the sandbars specifically because they can roost on the sandbars and they can hear any coyotes or foxes, splashing across the water to come out and potentially get them. So as the water fluctuates in that area, it could potentially affect the migrations, and what we're learning is that we are seeing less flow in that area, and it is very controlled, dammed, and there's lots of agriculture. So the students got a little bit of knowledge about that. They did, of course, also learn about the negotiations going on between Colorado and Nebraska in terms of water. I think here in Colorado, we're frequently thinking about the Colorado River Compact and all the water that's flowing to the west, but there's also some negotiation with this water that's flowing to the east. I think another thing students took away from this experience, and this was I think from the matching of the film students and the social work students with the eco-justice bent, was this idea that species have inherent value. We're not just interested in the species for its utilitarian value, or even, in its value for wildlife photography. Like, they have a right to exist on their own. I mean, there were very interesting conversations going on. The film students are sitting there in the van talking about f-stops and ISO and, Canon versus Nikon, and the social work students are talking about, is there enough water for the birds, and how, birds have feelings too, or for lack of a better term. So, and then on the flip side, the film knowledge that I think all the students gained, whether they were the film students or the social work students, is that wildlife media work is not glamorous. We were up really, really early, 4 a.m. It was cold, it was hard, the batteries were dying. It's difficult, right? And interestingly, I think something that I believe they learned and that I would hope that they learned, because I think it helps you kind of grasp how to approach wildlife media work, is that wildlife are both predictable and unpredictable, right? Like, we know they're going to be on the river in the morning and they're going to leave at sunrise. That's going to happen. And we know they're going to come back to the river at night and roost there. Even if you're sitting there 30 minutes before dark and there are none there, they are coming. And I remember actually the first time I ever did this, I did it in Wisconsin. I was up there on the Wisconsin River and sitting there, and there were no birds anywhere on the river, and I had been told there were something like 20,000 birds. And I was like, where are these birds? And they weren't coming. But eventually, they do come. Nature has its cycles. So it's predictable. You can kind of figure out when to go out and get the shot. But on the other hand, you don't know which direction they're going to come from, and you don't know exactly where they're going to land. So you might have your camera facing this way, because you're trying to get them on this little island over here, but then they all fly in this way. And, it's not a big deal to change, but the students had to do a lot in terms of the mechanics and the technology to figure things out. So I feel like it was a good learning experience for them. Okay. Some of the student reflections from the trip, and we were actually able to write an article just for our, DU newsletter that is actually linked to the BEA site, if you'd like to check that out for this particular day. But some of the student reflections were that watching all the cranes take flight was majestic and a reminder that I get to share a world with such wonder and beauty. And that was from Jess Albright, who I believe just graduated with her master's in social work with a ecological focus. And then film student Kenzie Claflin says, the first time I heard the cranes, it almost made me forget where I was or what I was supposed to be doing because I was in such awe. And this actually was, just to give a little more context here, this was 6 in the morning, 5:30 in the morning, whatever it was, when the sun was coming up, when we were in these Audubon blinds. And you could kind of hear the cranes out there, but you couldn't see them yet. And then as the sun came up, they all kind of take off in mass. It's cacophonous, and it's overwhelming. So Kenzie mentioned she kind of forgot what she was doing. It was so amazing to behold.
And these are some more discipline-specific reflections that students had. In wildlife filmmaking, you need to be very adaptive and alert. Though we could predict where the cranes might be generally, it was difficult to find the best place to film them. And this is Kenzie again, a film student. And the next quote is from Lauren Manna, a social work student. There is a certain level of socioeconomic privilege implicit in the ability to take advantage of these opportunities. The trip made me consider how I might go about offering these opportunities to people without the time, money, or transportation.
All right, so we're continuing this work, we're happy to say, and actually we're returning to the row in about 3.5 weeks. We produced this short promo to kind of prove what we could do, and we sent it to Bill who you saw in the video at the Audubon, and he said, "You're the only media group that's ever made me look good." I don't know. You know, we're all self-conscious when we're on the camera, and I was like, well, it was just the lenses, man. We have nice lenses. But so we've set it up that they're going to pay us. We're going to go out, and we're going to shoot an educational video for them. And we're going to use the profits from that video basically to fund the trip to go out there to shoot it, to cover those costs, and then to return again in March of 2023. So we're pretty excited about that. We are, as I mentioned, working on a larger documentary about sandhill cranes. But we're also interested in developing this pilot. Again, this was like, let's get students out there, let's try something. But we'd like to formalize it, and some of the things we're thinking about for the future are including maybe some kind of talk on ethics in wildlife photography, right? Not getting too close, not disturbing the animals, how far are you going to go to get the shot? We talked a little bit about that on the trip, but I'm hoping to partner with some people in the Kearney area to perhaps provide a presentation like that to our students. And we're also looking at maybe doing some kind of swap of knowledge where the film students will teach, that's the Graduate School of Social Work students, the IHAC students about cameras, about media, and then vice versa, the Graduate School of Social Work students will teach the film students about their ecological knowledge. We also, of course, want to encourage students to reflect more deeply on environmental issues and art as a communication tool. I think that this has been particularly interesting for the social work students who are doing pretty heavy social science research and publishing in academic journals and doing a really great job of that, but they're wondering, like, how can we translate this research? And that's actually where I'm going to segue to something else that kind of dovetails with this, which is some research that Katia has been doing about habitat loss, species loss, and something that we did talk about on the trip because we feel as if it could be impacting what's going on in Kearney.
So I have been completing research with Dr. Sarah Bexell and Lauren Manna on the psychological impacts of wildlife loss on conservation professionals. The reason that we're doing this research is we've had a lot of anecdotal evidence, colleagues coming to us who've witnessed the suffering and death of individual wildlife individuals, as well as the extinction of entire species, and mentioned that this has really taken a toll on their mental health. So we were wondering, is there a phenomenon here? It hasn't really been studied. So for this study, it was an exploratory pilot study with 6 participants. We utilized a modified photo voice research methodology in which we had participants select and describe photos from their careers based on 2 prompts. The first, photographs that bring up negative emotional experiences to this day in relation to their careers. And second, photographs that demonstrate participant contribution to the protection of wildlife. After we collected all of this data, we hosted 2 90-minute focus groups with 3 participants in each group. And then we analyzed that data, so that is both from the photograph descriptions as well as from our focus group transcripts. And we identified these 2 major themes: areas of risk and areas of resilience. And you will see more about those in the next slide in my video slideshow. And really, our future directions here are participants really express that we don't have terminology to describe what they're going through. So as a social worker, I'm curious, can we develop terminology and give this a name? And second, how can we support the mental health of conservation professionals so that they can continue doing this really critical work?
All right, so yours was...
Okay, and then the video.
All right, so apologies for that tech glitch, but thanks for being patient. We have like one or two more slides. I'll just bring that up. But so Professor Sarah Bexell, who couldn't be here today, participated in this study, and I remember speaking with her individually about it, and I was interested to hear from her that, she's been in conservation work for 30 years, and she's saying, a lot of her colleagues got into conservation work because they loved animals, they loved the science, they loved the research, but now they're finding, right, that there's just a lot of bad news, and that they're always asked to present on their research findings, but not asked to present on, how it impacts them psychologically. So that's why I think Katia and Sarah's work is really important. That's it.
Okay, and then that's just the video.
That's it, okay.
So, thank you. If you'd like to get in touch, those are our emails. Great. That's it.
Just want to thank our panel today for such insightful projects and interesting reflections on your work. And I know we probably want to get over to the reception pretty soon, so I can pose a question to the panel and throw it open. We might have a few minutes for folks in the audience, but one thing I wanted to know, all of your talks brought up how these human-wildlife interactions, they touch on a lot of really sensitive topics, whether it's complex emotional responses that we may have to these phenomenon, cultural factors, political factors, and I'm wondering if the panel has any tips for how you go about crafting these stories or structuring messaging in an effective way, given these sensitive topics. Anybody care to take that on?
Try to, I don't know if this
Might have to turn the mics on.
I can walk up there. Are they all on? Okay. I guess I consider a lot of my work to be more on the creative side, so I don't know that I have a good answer for that, except to say I don't know that there's enough room for just enjoying nature via media these days, which sounds kind of absurd to say because we should just maybe go out in media, but I mean, I've watched a lot of environmental documentaries. I've programmed environmental documentary film festivals and made quite a few, but I guess I'm really interested in like observational wildlife footage where we just watch the animals and just kind of be with them and observe. I've showed some pieces on sandhill cranes, like 3 or 4 minute, just completely observational pieces at conferences and at film festivals, similar to this, but without any humans talking. And frequently at a conference in the winter or something, right? And then people have come up to me afterwards and said, that lowered my blood pressure. And I was like, wow, that's awesome, so in the dark days. Sometimes I think, we are bombarded by messaging. So maybe just enjoying beautiful visuals when you can't get outside is helpful. I didn't answer your question.
Maybe it's working? Yeah, it's working. Trying to think in terms of some of the work we do with bird collisions. I capture a tremendous amount of joy in bird watching and seeing migratory birds and seeing the good parts, but then some of the negative parts, right, of birds colliding with buildings and fatally colliding, having, just somehow remarkably made it that far to only collide with a building. And those are, the negative things, but also that negative, the public seeing those images is quite gripping and has easily shifted policies and conservation action. So while they're challenging to see, a pile of 10 dead, colorful songbirds sitting in front of a window, it's that type of messaging through social media, posting photos on Twitter, tagging different building managers to say, is this ultimately the image that you want to portray? And change happens sometimes quickly through that social pressure that, within 2 weeks now a window that was very reflective or very bright is colored in a layer that birds can see, or where there's now dots on the window to prevent those collisions. So there's a lot of feelings wrapped up in those things. They're challenging. I find it remarkable that people wake up every morning in New York City to go do a loop to find dead birds. And it's just, it's good work that they are doing. The best thing that, they would hope for is they do that loop and they don't see a bird. They don't see a dead songbird. But to do that time and time again and find nothing can be disheartening too, right? Why am I out here looking for these things when I can't find them? And then when you do, and you make that post and you raise awareness and conservation changes, I think that's very rewarding. And that's, it seems to be that's what helps them wake up every morning, spring and fall, to do those loops in New York City and Houston and Dallas and Fort Worth, all across the country in some of these cities.
And just really quickly, in social marketing, one of the things we try to do is understand what do people want to get out of their wildlife experiences and what might be influencing their behaviors. And one thing that always fascinates me, I don't have an answer to this, but I think about how do we shape what people expect and want out of their experiences in nature. Because, ideally they would all be just like me, and those of us in the room here, and they would, be really vigilant about everything that they do most of the time. We recognize that people aren't going to be perfect 100% of the time, but so long as a trend is moving towards improving and how their behavior might be impacting wildlife, that's all well and good. But how do we actually begin to shape people so that they go out into nature with different expectations than they might be coming in with?
Does anyone from the audience have any questions that they'd like to pose to the panel? Yes.
Yeah, that's a great question. I often have this feeling when I'm flying in a plane and I look down of trying to think about what a bird might be seeing. And what a bird might be seeing and what we see are probably quite different, right? Most aircraft fly at 20, 30,000 feet. Most birds do not get up that high. So it's sort of that takeoff part that I try to imagine looking down of what the landscape looks like to a small songbird. And I can't quite imagine it, probably, not the way they are doing it. But the airlines are invested in understanding bird migration for things like collisions with aircraft that have human safety issues as well, right? Many songbirds will easily pass through the jet engine of a passenger plane. The things that cause issues are large birds, sandhill cranes, Canada geese, where we get these really important things that shift how we understand interactions between wildlife and humans, where we have an aircraft crashing around New York City in the river, right? That one's due to collision with a flock of Canada geese. So we can do some of this. We've had interactions with aircraft and aviation where we actually make forecasts of where and when birds will be migrating across the U.S. Aviation companies are interested in that and providing that information to their pilots. We don't want to take on the risk of saying, the collision, we can ultimately predict if there's going to be a collision or not, but it's another layer of information that pilots can ingest to shift their behaviors while in flight to hopefully create more safe conditions for them and their passengers.
Anybody else? Yes, Rylan.
Oh, shoot.
How do you help people understand that it's not just a catchphrase, that it's not just a graphic, and help that idea go into action?
Yeah, so working on that right now. Yeah, so they look at, of course, just like people, going into a camping experience and thinking about storing their food, you want it to be as easy as possible. So I think when you have wildlife managers, wildlife biologists looking at like, oh, this is a social marketing campaign. Oh, here's some things I can download and insert my wildlife in, and I will have done social marketing. That's pretty easy, right? And so, like on the surface, if they look at what to use or what to do, they pick and choose those things because that's a quick edit and print button, slap on bathroom wall, done. And so, collaborating with the Park Service and with NOAA and with nonprofits, one of the ideas that we had was to create like a guidebook for them to evaluate how they develop systems and processes to shape visitor behavior with the social marketing framework. So they can take that guidebook and look at how they are educating and training their staff, the processes that they have for making decisions about facilities and infrastructure, processes for how we treat our communication staff and not how we treat them, how we utilize them to the best possible way. And so using that guidebook to sort of overhaul how they are approaching the use of the tools and processes that they already have and use, and apply the social marketing framework to that, and just helping them understand there's a lot more pieces than just the catchphrase or the ad, that it's an entire framework for approaching human behavior change.
Just to follow up, there was a program that Rocky Mountain National Park used this summer about staying off the tundra.
I didn't see that one.
Social media campaign. Was that part of your effort or your collaboration with them?
No, but I do regularly like to claim the funny posts on Instagram as part of my influence, but no. But I did work with Rocky Mountain National Park. They were, of course, one of our parks that we worked closely with early on in the projects in like 2015 and 16. And we worked with a number of staff there and conducted trainings and recorded videos for their volunteers and things like that on how do you utilize social marketing approaches. So I like to think, but maybe not. Oh, good. I'll have to look into that. Thanks for sharing.
One final question? We'll take from Jacob, and then we can make your announcement. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to ask Kate, have you pursued like more of a consequentialist format of campaign where like you're trying to evoke a sense of like guilt or that you were in the wrong for what you're doing? Because
Yeah.
I think we've seen that today, like where there's this much more pessimistic outlook. I was wondering how you found that to work.
Yeah, and hearing like Kyle talk about sharing the posts of the dead, dead birds and things like that, those fear appeals or consequentialist approach can be useful in certain contexts and can elevate attention and awareness and maybe garner action in certain spaces, like let's create a policy or let's invest in this new technology to address this. But when it comes to like your park visitor, for example, that might bring attention and elevate awareness. But if there's still other barriers in the way of them putting their food in the bear box or staying the distance, and a lot of times, it's not that they aren't aware that you can be gored by a bison, it's that probably not this bison. It just doesn't look like it's gonna happen. And you become overly confident, like I am better than other people, so I'm going to successfully serve. So like a host of other factors come into play. So, and we had actually seen the parks had already done a lot of that and conducting content analyses for their communication approaches. You would see photos of the horse kicking somebody in the face, of the bison throwing someone in the air, the elk pummeling into a car. And so they'd used a lot of fear appeals, or even signs in California saying like, did you kill this bear? So that sort of like shame approach. and it still persisted as a problem. So trying some different messaging was one of the goals of this project, because those tactics were already in place. So we know, okay, we've got this baseline data and these tactics are producing these results. How do we improve it even further through social marketing?
Roz?
Right. The junior ranger programs and things like that exist in national parks to do that. There's some outreach through schools and things like that. And that's, you know, that area of education and encouraging youth can be really, really useful maybe to that idea that I brought up earlier of like, it would be interesting to know how do we reshape people's expectations for their experiences with wildlife.
Well, I'm guessing we should continue some of these great conversations in our reception. Greg, did you want to make any announcements or final remarks for today?
I guess first and most important is that there is free food at the reception. I know that the 4 photographers stuck around all day for the free food at the reception. Thank you very much. The full photo panel stayed here. There's some really heavy stuff that we came across today, you know, including hippos, which are heavy anyway, and pythons, which seem to be able to survive wherever they are, and then many birds and other species that don't seem to be able to have that easy a go of it. And we can unpack an awful lot of stuff from what we saw today. Hopefully next year we'll have this again. We'll have 10 times the audience because people will have heard about this. And we have been recording this, we meaning Steve Weiss and Cassidy Esposito, who are part of the journalism and media communication department's RAM productions unit. That's a lot to kick out, but it's a live production unit. And I think Cassidy has promised, I don't know if she can hear me or not, to have this edited by tomorrow, and that's a joke. A 4-camera shoot is a lot of work to cut and edit and put together and make sense, but we will get these posted online so that you can share these with anybody you want to. I really think that the mix of presentations today was great, and I think this panel at the end of the day really brought it home for me. Thank you very much for coming. If you were a presenter, excellent images. I'd like to put a shout out to the photo group here because they all are willing to sell you some of their prints if you want, and you can find them all online. Thank you very much for coming. Hope to see you upstairs.